guys, it's another thing here on YouTube. So today I would definitely like to talk about one of the biggest news that has been going on in the past week, which is of course the China protest. So I suppose most of us thought it was mainly about the zero COVID policy until this clip suddenly became viral on the internet, featuring the protesters basically shouting "Step down CCP." In many other clips, people were also demanding the President Xi to step down. In several other clips, the protesters were also demanding freedom and democracy. So of course this came as a huge shock for a lot of us who previously had this image of most Chinese people being super loyal to the CCP and would always support and obey everything they do. So today I want to talk about this whole thing kind of from a Taiwanese perspective and talk a little bit about how I've seen Chinese people reacting to this on the internet. Of course I don't have direct contact with them, but fortunately I do understand Mandarin Chinese. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I've been reading on the internet that might have been overlooked by the Western media, and then I'm also going to talk about how the Taiwanese people have been reacting to this whole thing, and finally how this event might potentially lead to the change of the relationship between China and Taiwan. But first, I would definitely like to briefly summarize what has been going on. So it all started with this fire accident that happened in Xinjiang. So during this accident, unfortunately, quite a few victims lost their lives because of this overly strict zero COVID policy. So they were basically trapped inside the building, unable to get out, unable to run to a safe place from the fire. So after this, a lot of Chinese people realized that this zero COVID policy is going too far. So several of them stepped on the street to have protest against this zero COVID policy, and they were basically demanding a less strict COVID policy. But over the past weekends, the whole situation somehow just escalated. The protesters started to demand things that are beyond the COVID policy itself. So a lot of people were shouting for freedom and democracy, and a lot of people were shouting for the President Xi to step down and even the CCP to step down, as we have seen in the clips. So the protests have basically turned into the biggest movement since 1989 Tiananmen Square events, and they name it Blank Paper Revolution because during the protest, all of the protesters will be holding a piece of white A4 paper to show their discontent. So over the past week, I have been reading through posts on these subreddits to keep myself updated from the local Chinese people and see what they think from their perspectives. So one phrase that kept being mentioned is this, 大的要来了, which means something big is going to happen. So it could either mean that they think with this protest as a start, there's going to be a huge revolution on a scale never seen before in China, or the government could possibly pull out something very extreme to deal with the protesters, kind of like what they did in the Tiananmen Square event. But what I found most interesting is that actually there are many different reactions and perspectives from different Chinese people. Even among the protesters, each protester seemed to want very different things to begin with. And this is kind of one of the reasons people are pointing out that might lead to the failure of this protest, because essentially they're not really making their purpose clear. It's kind of like different protesters are shouting different things and demanding different things. There's not a clear purpose that everyone can agree on. So generally speaking, there are Chinese people who support the protest, there are those who do not support the protest, and there are those who do not know about the protest at all. And those who support the protest, as I said, also want many different things. So there's the first group who only want to focus on the zero COVID policy. So those are the people who are only demanding for changes in the COVID policy, and a lot of them are actually annoyed by other people turning it into something else, like those people who are shouting for freedom, democracy, and for Xi to step down. A lot of them are actually showing frustrations to these people because they only want to focus on the matter of the COVID policy. And then there's this other group of people who are chanting for freedom and democracy, but those people are not necessarily against CCP. I saw a post the other day in the subreddits that says wanting democracy and supporting the CCP are not contradictory to each other. other. So a lot of them, in fact, are still supportive of the CCP, but they still want to have democracy and freedom under the CCP rule. And then there's this other group of people, those are the ones that are chanting for Xi, the President Xi, to step down. So these people likely are also supportive of the CCP, but they just do not want this president anymore. They want to change a president instead of Xi. And then this other group of the Chinese people that are very clearly against the CCP. So most likely they have already been discontent with the CCP for a really long time, but this zero COVID policy is kind of the last straw for them to step out and make their voices heard. But even within this type of Chinese people, there are still two types. One type is the ones that not only against the CCP, but also they support the freedom for Hong Kong and for Xinjiang, and also they support, for example, for Taiwan to be recognized officially as a country. So we actually have a lot of this type of Chinese people in the subreddits. So ever since that clip came out with people shouting "Step down CCP," they have been making a lot of posts hoping that there's going to be a revolution that overthrow the CCP, and also some of them have been making jokes and trolling about the possibility of the Republic of China taking over the mainland. But then of course there are also a lot of people who are, although against the CCP and do not want the CCP to rule China anymore, they still consider Taiwan a part of them and genuinely still hope that the ROC will one day unify with the PRC. So because recently there are also demonstrations going on outside China to support these protesters, some people seem to be shouting other different things. For example, Taiwan is a country, or free Hong Kong and Tibet, stuff like this. So some people in the subreddits are also kind of complaining about this. Like some Chinese people are frustrated that people are also shouting this in the demonstrations, because for them, being against the CCP and supporting Taiwan are two different things. So again, there are just so many different groups of protesters who all want different things, and a group of protesters can actually be annoyed by the other group of the protesters. So even though they're all protesters, they could get triggered and frustrated at each other for different values they hold and for different things they want for the future of China. Okay, now moving on to how Taiwanese people have been reacting to this event. So a lot of Taiwanese people, including myself, are actually quite happy to see that finally some Chinese people who have opinions different from the CCP standing out to make their voices heard. So because of this, a group of Taiwanese people are definitely being quite supportive of these protesters. So in the Liberty Square, there was a group of Taiwanese people there showing their condolences to the victims in the fire accident, and also a lot of people were gathering there to voice their support for the protesters in China. But on the other hand, there are Taiwanese people who find it difficult to sympathize with the protesters. Of course, they can sympathize with the victims in the fire, but not those protesters. Because for them, when the CCP government were threatening to invade Taiwan, those are the people who were silent and they weren't of any help when Taiwan was under this threat. So now they don't really feel the need to return any favor. And secondly, as I've already said, a lot of these protesters, although they're standing up kind of against the CCP, in their heart, they still consider Taiwan a part of them and do not support Taiwan's independence. So for a lot of Taiwanese people, they think that it's also pointless to support them because of this. So when it comes to how this might potentially lead to the change of the China and Taiwan situation, some people are already worrying that the Chinese government might invade Taiwan soon to kind of distract people's attention. But most other people, including myself, don't really believe that this is going to happen, because it just doesn't really make any sense when lots of protests everywhere is already happening in your country and you're still looking to invade someone else. But if this movement ends up being the start of more and more Chinese people wanting democracy in China, then I guess there is a possibility of China ever becoming democratic. It's not going to be an easy road, but there is always still the possibility. And if that ever happens, this is definitely going to change the relationship between China and Taiwan very significantly. So on the one hand, if China ever becomes democratic, then they probably will not take the method of invading Taiwan to have a unification. And on the the other hand, right now a lot of Taiwanese people do not want to unify with China exactly because of the CCP and their human rights violation issues. So if China ever becomes democratic, I feel like maybe more Taiwanese people will be able to accept a unification. So my personal guess is that because at that point both sides will be democratic, so maybe there's going to be a vote, like a universal suffrage within Taiwan to see if more people want to become independent or unification. But of course, those are just possibilities in the future that have not happened yet. But I have actually already been seeing some changes in the relationship, not the political relationship between China and Taiwan, but actually the relationship between people on both sides. Like, I do think that it is kind of improving because of this event. So on the one hand, from Taiwanese perspective, a lot of people are realizing that not all Chinese peoples are loyal CCP supporters. Not all of them would just silently accept and tolerate CCP's human rights violations behaviors. And because of this, as I said, a lot of Taiwanese people are being quite supportive of them, and a lot of us are actually expecting and hoping to see more Chinese people standing out for their own rights. And in return, I have seen several Chinese people showing their appreciation to the support coming from Taiwan. And what's even more surprising, it seems like right now on the internet, some Chinese people are making apologies to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, basically places that have previously voiced against the CCP. Some comments admitted that because the information they got were controlled by the CCP and thus all voices against the Chinese government were painted in a rather negative light. They previously failed to see things from others' perspectives. But now that they're personally in this situation, feeling threatened by the CCP, they're finally able to understand the bravery and the reason behind standing up against the CCP. So some of them, through this event, they're starting to be able to see things from our perspectives. So I'm really glad to see this. I do see this as an improvement, even not like from an international relations scale, but at least people from both sides, some of them are starting to warm up to each other and have more conversations and become friendly with each other. So I mean, it does seem like a good start for a more peaceful interactions between the two sides. Okay, final thoughts. So for some reasons, I'm seeing a lot of people saying that because the protest will unlikely bring any real changes to China, the protest itself is said to be meaningless. Well, I really have to strongly disagree with this. So the way I see it, it is the first time in forever we see Chinese people standing out and saying something against the government. And right now, their voices are being heard by the entire world. So I read this comment from a Chinese person saying that they really hope through this event the entire world can change their mind about Chinese people. Like, not all Chinese people are these so-called little pink who would just blindly follow whatever the CCP does. And I definitely think that so far this part has been quite successful, to say the least. And I don't understand why people like to focus so much on whether or not this particular protest will be successful or not, because of course it's not going to be that easy. Like when the Qing dynasty was overthrown, the Republic of China went through 11 revolutions, and it took Taiwan a 228 massacre and an entire 40 years under the White Horror period to get to the democracy that we have today. So of course it's not going to be that easy. Of course it's not going to be like one protest and China forever change, but for every change there has to be a start. And especially for there to be any hope for China to ever change, the Chinese people themselves have to want this change to begin with. So that being said, I'm definitely on the side that support these protesters, even though maybe a lot of them still have very different opinions when it comes to the topic of Taiwan. But I do think that they deserve this rights that they're fighting for, and I also have a lot of respect for them, for their bravery to stand out and fight for their rights. Okay, so that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, so please leave a like if you did, and please subscribe for more content about Taiwan and possibly the relationship between Taiwan and China. And I will see you in the next video.